Princess Anne did not need to raise her voice. When she saw it, she responded the only way institutions do when they feel exploited.
What the documentary unveiled next didn't just raise eyebrows, it hit like a wrecking ball, because it didn't stop at describing the alleged recording incident. It claimed to go further. It presented what it said was audio of Meghan in a palace corridor afterward, speaking rapidly on her phone, energized, focused, giving clear instructions to someone on the other end. And according to the film, the tone of that call wasn't sentimental. It wasn't reflective. It wasn't about preserving memories. The documentary alleges the conversation centered on production, on editing, on slicing up audio into segments that could be shaped into something usable. Let that sink in. A recorded voice is raw material. It can be rearranged, words can be clipped, sentences can be isolated, pauses can be removed, context can disappear. And when context disappears, meaning shifts, meaning can flip completely. The documentary's implication was heavy. If someone has private audio of the Queen, and that audio can be edited, you could theoretically reshape the perception of what she said. You could create emphasis where none existed. You could remove clarifications. You could present fragments as full truths. That isn't documentation. That's strategic construction. Then the film pivoted. It moved from a single shocking moment to something it framed as more troubling: pattern recognition. Because isolated incidents can be explained, people can call them misunderstandings, mistakes, emotional moments. But when similar behaviours repeat, they stop looking random. They start looking intentional. The documentary introduced testimony from 2 palace employees, not celebrities, not media figures, staff members whose lives operate behind closed doors. According to their accounts, Meghan allegedly approached each of them separately, friendly, warm, confidential, and in those private conversations, she reportedly told each one that the other had been criticizing them, that the other had questioned their competence, that the other doubted their performance. It's a tactic many workplace psychologists recognize: triangulation. You create tension between 2 people by feeding each of them selective or false information about the other. Once mistrust takes root, conflict grows naturally, and once conflict exists, it can be pointed to as proof of dysfunction. Both employees, according to the documentary, later confirmed they had never made those critical statements about each other. Both described a slow realization that they were being positioned against one another. That's not loud sabotage, that's subtle engineering. The film's argument was direct. If you need evidence of a toxic workplace but none organically exists, you create the conflict and then highlight it as proof. The environment becomes chaotic not by accident, but by design. From there, the documentary zoomed out. It shifted from individual claims to the broader mechanics of modern media power. It argued that Meghan understood something about narrative warfare that traditional institutions underestimated. The monarchy operates on restraint. Don't respond to every accusation. Don't fuel tabloids. Let time and duty prove integrity. That approach was built for an older media era: newspapers, scheduled broadcasts, slower cycles. But the digital age doesn't reward silence. It rewards emotion, speed, viral impact. The documentary claimed Meghan recognized that in the attention economy, controlling emotional perception is more powerful than controlling facts, not objective truth, perceived truth. And in modern culture, perception drives influence. Influence drives money. Money drives longevity. Think about how this plays out. A powerful, emotional interview airs: tears, pain, vulnerability, serious allegations. Millions watch. Social media clips circulate instantly. The emotional impression forms within minutes. Weeks later, if contradictory evidence appears, the impact isn't equal, because emotion landed first. And once people connect emotionally to a story, they resist information that challenges it. Accepting new information would mean reconsidering their initial reaction, and most people don't enjoy admitting they were misled. So what happens? Contradictory evidence gets reframed as retaliation, as institutional pushback, as an attempt to silence Opposition becomes confirmation of persecution. The documentary argued this dynamic trapped the palace. By staying silent, they allowed one narrative to solidify, but if they spoke up later, it could be framed as attacking someone who had already positioned herself as vulnerable. That's the strategic brilliance the film described. Speak first, speak emotionally, speak in a way that generates sympathy, then frame any contradiction as proof that you were right about being targeted. The documentary referred to this as narrative engineering. It suggested this approach wasn't accidental. It wasn't impulsive. According to analysts interviewed in the film, Meghan appeared to understand that a 5-minute emotional segment could reach more hearts than 1,000 pages of documentation. And the results supported that theory. Millions embraced her version because it felt authentic and immediate. Meanwhile, the palace's long-standing principle of never complain, never explain, suddenly looked outdated. In the modern climate, silence can be interpreted as guilt. Then came one of the documentary's most controversial claims. It suggested that Meghan's major public interviews weren't purely about healing or telling her truth. It framed them as preemptive positioning. According to Princess Anne's account presented in the film, after the alleged corridor incident involving the recording discussion, something shifted internally, not publicly, quietly. Trust eroded, access changed. Staff were reportedly instructed to document interactions more carefully. Boundaries tightened. The documentary claimed Meghan may have sensed this invisible shift, that she understood scrutiny had increased, that if internal concerns ever surfaced publicly, they could severely damage her credibility. So what's the move when you suspect damaging information might one day surface? You don't wait. You move first. You flood the space with your version. You anchor the narrative emotionally so deeply that any later contradiction appears cruel or retaliatory. The film portrayed this not as emotional collapse, but as calculated foresight. It highlighted how quickly high-profile interviews followed palace tensions, how the storyline escalated step by step, from struggling with institutional life to claims of emotional isolation to concerns about personal safety. Each escalation raised public sympathy. Each new layer made rebuttal riskier. Media analysts interviewed in the documentary described this as reputation insurance. You build such a powerful public identity as a victim that anyone challenging you becomes, in the eyes of many, the aggressor. One analyst used a financial metaphor. In insurance fraud, damage is staged before filing a claim. Here, the claim, public sympathy, was allegedly secured before any internal documentation could emerge. Then the documentary shifted focus again, because this wasn't just about public opinion anymore. It was about business. By the time Princess Anne's documentary aired, Meghan had secured substantial commercial partnerships, streaming contracts, publishing deals, podcast agreements, speaking engagements, each deal built on her narrative positioning. Corporations don't operate on emotional loyalty. They operate on risk calculation. When Meghan's version was the dominant narrative, she represented courage, independence, standing up to power. That's marketable. That builds audiences. That attracts consumers. But the moment a credible counter-narrative enters the public arena, especially one backed by structured documentation, the calculation changes instantly. Now brands ask different questions. What if public perception flips? What if association becomes liability? What if loyalty to her becomes damage to us? According to the documentary, within hours of the broadcast, corporate reactions began quietly, not dramatic press conferences, not public denunciations, but subtle moves. Projects paused, meetings postponed, contracts reviewed, emails exchanged behind closed doors. That kind of silence speaks loudly in corporate spaces. Modern companies have learned something critical. You can survive minor controversy, but being tied to the losing side of a major scandal can cost millions.
I've been a born pessimist all my life, but curious enough, I don't feel that about Save the Children Fund's work and never have done.
The film included commentary from financial analysts who called it reputation arbitrage, the moment when someone's market value swings from asset to risk. And when that flip happens, it doesn't decline slowly, it drops fast. One analyst summarized it sharply. Meghan's influence was rooted in narrative dominance. If that dominance fractures under competing evidence, her commercial leverage weakens immediately. That's why that California morning mattered so much. It wasn't just about headlines. It wasn't just about public debate. It was about contracts, revenue streams, future partnerships, the entire financial architecture built after stepping away from royal life. When the foundation of your brand is narrative control, and that control gets challenged publicly by someone like Princess Anne through a major broadcaster, the shockwaves hit every corner of your empire. And that's why, according to the documentary, the real impact of that broadcast wasn't emotional. It was structural. The most explosive part of the documentary didn't come from pictures, nor commentary, nor the dramatized reconstructions. It came from sound, audio. The film didn't just hint that something had been recorded. It presented what it claimed was an actual recording of Meghan in a corridor immediately after the archive incident, speaking on her phone, animated, energetic, issuing instructions to someone on the other end. And here's the bombshell. According to the documentary, she wasn't discussing preserving memories or cherishing the Queen's words. Not at all. Her conversation was about production, about editing, about cutting the recording in ways that would make it usable for later. Do you realise what that implies? A voice recording isn't static. Audio can be dissected, rearranged, cut and spliced. Context can be stripped, pauses removed, words taken out of sequence. Meaning can be inverted entirely. And if someone can manipulate the Queen's private words in this way, they could potentially make her sound like she said almost anything. This wasn't simple documentation. It was, as the film argued, the weaponization of trust. And that's when the documentary shifted gears. It moved from shocking, isolated incidents to a more chilling conclusion. Patterns. One-off mistakes can be explained. Misunderstandings happen. Missteps occur. But when a pattern emerges, it's strategy. The documentary made the argument that the archive incident and other episodes weren't isolated, they were part of a deliberate approach. The film introduced testimony from 2 palace employees, their stories small but revealing. Both described encounters with Meghan that started innocuously. She approached them separately, friendly, warm, smiling, and then she allegedly began to feed them information in confidence. Information suggesting that the other employee had been criticizing them, questioning their competence, subtly undermining their abilities. If you've ever seen workplace manipulation, this tactic will sound familiar. It's called triangulation, creating conflict between 2 people by feeding them selective information about each other. And when conflict exists, the narrative becomes self-evident. The story of a toxic environment materializes without anyone needing to fabricate it fully. It simply appears. Both employees confirmed that no such criticism existed, and they described the slow, disorienting realization that someone had been orchestrating tension between them deliberately. According to the documentary, this was strategy, not accident. Need proof of a hostile workplace but none exists. Engineer conflict, then point to it as evidence. That, the film argued, is how narrative warfare works in the modern media landscape. To grasp the significance of the documentary, the film spent time explaining this concept in detail. Meghan, it suggested, understood something the palace never fully adapted to. The monarchy operates on dignity through restraint. Don't answer every accusation. Don't feed tabloids. Trust that measured behaviour will be rewarded over time with public understanding. But that was a strategy built for a pre-digital age, an era without viral social media, without 24-hour emotional amplification, without platforms that value drama over facts. The documentary's argument was that Meghan recognised that attention equals power. Control the emotional narrative, and you control perceived reality. Not objective truth, perceived truth. In today's attention economy, perception is everything. One tearful, powerful interview can shift millions of opinions before evidence even emerges. Weeks or months later, facts may contradict the story, but by then, perception is fixed. The emotional impression already shapes public belief. The documentary emphasized the mechanics. Emotional interviews go viral. Millions engage instantly. People form judgments based on feelings, not documents. Later evidence contradicts the story, often ignored. Why? Accepting new information means admitting you were wrong, and nobody wants that sting. The documentary argued that the palace fell into this trap. Staying silent allowed one narrative to dominate, and by the time a response could be considered, responding would only reinforce Meghan's claims. Brilliant from a strategic standpoint. Speak first, speak emotionally, generate sympathy. Any later contradiction can be framed as hostility or suppression. The documentary labels this approach narrative engineering. According to the film, Meghan didn't stumble into it. She learned it, studied it. She understood that a 5-minute interview broadcast globally would reach far more people than a 1,000-page legal filing could ever hope to, and history proved her right. Millions accepted her version of events immediately because it was compelling, emotional, immediate. The palace's traditional reticence, never responding, never complaining, suddenly appeared less like composure and more like guilt or avoidance. The documentary suggested that this was exactly the intended effect. Then came what the film described as the preemptive strike. Meghan's choice to give major interviews and present public accusations wasn't framed as therapy or truth-telling alone. According to Princess Anne's account, after the corridor incident and the subsequent conversation about editing the Queen's recording, Meghan encountered an invisible institutional barrier. Trust had been broken. Staff began documenting interactions. Her access was being limited. The palace was quietly preparing a dossier, potentially damning, that could have ruined her reputation. So, what do you do when you anticipate damaging information might surface? You don't wait. You get ahead. You saturate the media space with your version first, and you make it compelling, emotional, sympathetic.
40 friends to donate 40 minutes of their time to help mentor a woman who's mobilizing back into the workforce.
So that any later contradiction appears not as correction, but as attack. The film presented this sequence as calculated, not chaotic. Meghan allegedly moved swiftly from palace incidents to global media interviews, shaping perception before the palace could respond. Each escalation heightened the stakes. Each claim made responding more fraught for the institution. According to the documentary, that was intentional. Media analysts included in the film describe this as reputation insurance, crafting such a strong victim narrative that anyone who later challenges it automatically appears villainous in public eyes. The documentary even likened it to insurance fraud in its metaphorical explanation. Stage the damage, claim victimhood, and secure public sympathy before any investigation catches up. The documentary then highlighted a critical moment, the termination of a cooperation agreement that arrived on Meghan's California morning. This wasn't just about public opinion, it was business, real contracts, real financial stakes, streaming platforms, publishing deals, speaking engagements, podcasts, all of them tied to a single factor, her narrative. Her story was her brand, and brands only partner when the story is sufficiently convincing and commercially safe. Corporate partnerships, the documentary explained, operate on calculated risk. Philosophical truth doesn't matter as much as perception. Will association boost brand value or create backlash? And until Princess Anne's documentary aired, Meghan's narrative remained unchallenged, making her highly valuable. Her image as someone standing up to institutional power was marketable, monetizable. People admired the courage. It sold products, drew audiences, built platforms. Once credible counter-narrative surfaced, backed by documentation, the risk assessment flipped instantly. Companies began quietly re-evaluating. Agreements were postponed, projects delayed, terminations executed silently. Strategic silence, the documentary argued.
And I think a lot of that gets lost in what can be super dehumanizing when you look at the clickbait culture and
is louder than press releases because it signals careful recalculation. Modern corporations, it said, have learned one hard lesson: survive scandal, but never support the losing side. The documentary included analysis from media experts calling this phenomenon reputation arbitrage. When narrative control flips, market value can collapse quickly. Meghan's public worth, the film suggested, had been entirely tied to the perception of her story. challenge that story, and the foundation crumbles. This, the documentary concluded, is why that California morning was so consequential. It wasn't just about opinion polls or fleeting headlines. It wasn't just about public sympathy or condemnation. It was about the structural base of everything she had built after leaving the palace. The contracts, the partnerships, the platforms, the income streams, all contingent on narrative dominance. Once that dominance was publicly challenged by Princess Anne's documentary, everything became uncertain. Everything could shift.
I think you feel really confident that it was divinely ordered. Maybe all of this, our friendship, you becoming our...
And that, the film implied, is the moment when a carefully constructed empire starts to wobble because reputation is currency and narrative control is the bank that holds it. Because at the core, all of these carefully engineered moves, every interview, every public statement, every media maneuver, worked only as long as the story remained hers. And once the palace finally spoke, once documentation and first-hand accounts entered the public domain, the rules of the game changed. The California morning wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a structural shock to the foundation of Meghan's post-palace empire. And that's exactly why this moment mattered so much, because it wasn't about public sentiment alone. It wasn't even just about prestige. It was about the very real scaffolding of influence, opportunity, and financial power that had been meticulously built around a single version of events. Once that version was challenged, the stakes weren't just emotional, they were existential. It was the fragility of influence exposed, and the documentary made it clear that every carefully nurtured advantage, every carefully marketed truth now faced scrutiny and potential collapse. And it all comes back to that one statement, the one that echoes through the entire film. Her story was only as valuable as the narrative she controlled, and once that control was contested, the structural integrity of everything she built, her brand, her deals, her image, was suddenly in question. That California morning wasn't simply a bad day in the headlines. It was a turning point that could redefine the trajectory of everything she had established since leaving the palace. Her business model was,
Because it feels really inclusive and there's representation and it's just like a sweet love story.
quite literally, her story. And if that story was ever credibly challenged, every pillar of her carefully constructed empire could collapse in an instant. Everything she had built, streaming deals, podcast contracts, speaking engagements, book deals, was underpinned by her persona, a narrative meticulously curated to capture sympathy, admiration, and influence. The documentary dives deep into this notion, showing that the story itself was not merely a reflection of events, but a strategic tool capable of shaping public perception, driving cultural influence, and ultimately translating into both social and financial capital. It argues convincingly that the stakes weren't just personal, they were business critical. One of the most difficult sections for viewers to confront is the documentary's discussion of emotional weaponization. It's a concept that makes many uncomfortable because it challenges deeply held assumptions about human behavior and vulnerability. The suggestion here is profound. Emotional displays, tears, visible distress, vulnerability can be intentionally leveraged as instruments of influence. They are not simply spontaneous expressions of genuine feeling. They can be tools deployed to guide perception, elicit sympathy, or manipulate outcomes. Princess Anne addresses this point directly, speaking carefully but firmly. She does not claim that Meghan Markle never felt genuine emotion, nor does she argue that all her tears were false. What she does argue, however, is that Meghan understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the palace, how emotion could be calibrated and deployed strategically. The documentary demonstrates this pattern repeatedly, showing situations where Meghan's emotional state would shift with astonishing speed depending on the audience and the stakes. She could cry in moments of confrontation, then compose herself immediately after. She could appear fragile and exposed in public, while simultaneously orchestrating complex instructions in private. Staff accounts describe these transitions not as errors or accidents, but as intentional, sophisticated, emotional management, executed with precision and awareness. To further explore this, the documentary introduces a psychologist specializing in workplace behavior who explains the concept of strategic emotionality. This is the ability to access and display emotions not as spontaneous reactions, but as tools for communication and influence. Most people cannot cry on command. Most cannot instantly switch from panic to charm in response to circumstance. Those who can, however, gain an unusual power. Their emotions become functional instruments capable of shaping interactions, guiding perception, and even influencing outcomes. In this framework, emotions are no longer purely internal experiences. They are calculated signals. The film stresses that this is not about denying the reality of emotions, but about understanding how skillful individuals can use them to navigate complex social and institutional landscapes. The documentary applies this framework to key public moments: interviews where Meghan cried, appearances in which she seemed fragile or overwhelmed, and even subtle body language that suggested vulnerability. Each is reinterpreted through the lens of strategic intention. The filmmakers ask the audience to reconsider everything. Could these displays of suffering have been deliberately timed and positioned to influence public opinion? Could apparent vulnerability be a tool of narrative control rather than merely a reflection of genuine distress? These questions unsettle viewers precisely because they force a confrontation with something deeply uncomfortable: the possibility that perception can be manipulated even when emotions are real in the moment. Central to this argument is the need for corroboration and pattern recognition. Emotional displays alone are insufficient to establish truth. They must be analysed in context, alongside evidence of consistency or orchestration. To that end, the documentary presents testimony from individuals who remained silent for years: palace staff, security personnel, administrative workers, people whose careers depended on discretion, whose livelihoods required loyalty, and whose identities could be compromised by speaking out. The film emphasizes that silence is not always protection. Over time, it can enable deception and allow patterns of manipulation to go unchallenged. One former staff member, whose identity is concealed, recounts the psychological burden of witnessing the public narrative diverge sharply from reality. You watch someone on television crying about isolation, about cruelty, about how no one helped them, and you remember what actually happened: the offers of guidance that were refused, the staff who tried to help but were shut out, the unfair blame placed on others. You stay silent because it's your job, your duty. But when you see an entire persona, an entire career built on a story you know is incomplete, you have to ask yourself, is protecting privacy worth allowing falsehoods to define history? Thomas, a staff member accused of attempting unauthorized access to Diana's archive, recounts years of fear, hesitation, and a constant avoidance of attention. Yet the documentary shows that there comes a point when continued silence ceases to be protective and becomes complicity. These accounts form a compelling pattern: multiple witnesses, independent of each other, reporting consistent behaviors, instructions, and outcomes. Princess Anne's intervention, the documentary argues, was motivated by this pattern. The palace had relied for decades on silence and discretion, believing that restraint and dignity were sufficient to protect both institution and reputation. But when a pattern emerged of strategic narrative manipulation, intrusion, and emotional orchestration, silence could no longer shield the monarchy. It became necessary to act, to provide evidence-based clarity, to confront a carefully curated public narrative with documentation, testimony, and analysis. The evidence presented is extensive. Time-stamped CCTV footage allegedly shows Meghan entering restricted archives. Audio recordings capture private instructions to media contacts and publicists, including detailed discussions of timing, framing, and target outlets for maximum emotional impact. Written communications, internal logs, emails, and staff documentation are presented as further corroboration, creating a multidimensional picture of institutional challenges and individual strategy. Importantly, the witnesses providing testimony come from different departments, with no apparent coordination, yet their accounts consistently describe the same behaviors, methods, and outcomes. The documentary emphasizes that viewers are not being asked to accept these claims blindly. Instead, it encourages critical evaluation. Can security footage be dismissed as coincidental? Can multiple independent testimonies be ignored? Can audio demonstrating intent be overlooked? These questions extend beyond celebrity gossip into the realm of institutional accountability, perception management, and modern narrative warfare. The stakes are real. Corporations, streaming platforms, and brands all depend on public perception, and the alignment of narrative with business interests can determine immediate financial consequences. The documentary concludes with a striking point. Once someone with detailed knowledge of events chooses to speak, armed with evidence rather than emotion, the balance of power shifts. Silence is broken, documentation confronts narrative, and performance must answer to proof. The palace, long assumed slow or restrained, has finally acted with precision and purpose, demonstrating that evidence can alter perception, correct narratives, and reshape reputational realities. And so the story, while still unfolding, has taken a decisive turn. The palace is no longer silent. Its quiet, deliberate voice now challenges the assumption that whoever speaks first, most emotionally, or most loudly automatically commands the truth. In this new chapter, documentation, corroboration, and evidence are the ultimate arbiters. What do you think after seeing all this? Has the evidence presented in the documentary shifted your perspective? Could the carefully curated public persona have been as calculated as it appears? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your questions, and your take on this unprecedented royal revelation. And if you want to stay updated on every development, every insight, and every behind-the-scenes story, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our breaking royal news.